History is not even history. These events still impact us daily. If I needed to tell my medieval history students that the Protestant Reformation and all of the problems and advantages that came with it are still in force, it affects us every day. And you studying history can be more than just sort of an excursion down learned lane. It can actually give you a little bit of insight to where you feel like you understand the things that are going on in your world. And one of the things today we'll get to is the Shiite and the Sunnis. So, Trev, I don't know if you're on recording yet, since I'm hemming and hawing, but I'll go ahead and get started here. So this lesson, we want to look at the first caliphs. I want to say a few things about Muhammad, because I kind of wrapped up the end of his life real quickly last week, and then we'll move on. These are the dates in the early Middle Ages. His calling in 610, and we ended with his military career, which lasts almost a decade. In that time, Muhammad engages in up to about 70 battles that he is personally involved in. And that's important because he sets precedent. Since he's the prophet, he's widely regarded as sinless. He's widely regarded as the exemplar for what other people should be. And so, kind of like with Jesus of Nazareth, we watch closely. As the New Testament says, the Pharisees watched to see what he would say. So, in those battles, especially toward the end, they become more violent. We have one case where a whole Jewish tribe is wiped out through beheading. And he personally participates in that. And so even though, as we saw earlier, that for the most part, Jews and Christians have secondary citizenship and are not to be molested in any way, there are exceptions. And so if there are beheadings, specifically of Jews, even today, it cannot be said that there's no precedent for this in the life of Muhammad himself. He personally presided over it. So that's a big issue. Another is his increasing acquisition of wives. At the height of his military career, as many as 2 a year, and his divorce of several wives. Sometimes, at least in one particular case, his consummation of a marriage with a girl only 9 years old. Now again, as long as he's regarded as the exemplar of perfection, then no one coming after him can question whether those practices are legitimate. He has made them legitimate by his example. At the end of his career, up to now, because he was kicked out of Mecca, he has been able to portray warfare as defense. We are just taking back what was taken from us. But at the end of his career, he goes on the aggressive, and he calls for jihad against the whole non-Muslim civilized world. And none of them have done anything to the Arabs or to Muhammad. And so now, at the end of his life, the jihad becomes an aggressive project of world conquest. Now, technically, he specifically says the pagans, that would be at this point the Persians, they can convert or they can be killed. Those are their choices. As far as Jews and Christians, hypothetically, if they submit to Islamic rule, then they can live and practice their faith privately as second-class citizens. But of course, if they resist, then there's going to be warfare until there's political conquest. And that's important, I think, too, to understand what's going on in the Middle East today, the war between Israel and Hamas, because everybody in America is all worked up about racism and everything, and they see everything through this narrow lens. But the Jews had lived for a long time in the Holy Land, peaceably with occasional disruptions alongside Muslims. The issue is that there's a Jewish state. The Jewish state is what needs to be eradicated. It's a political movement. And the two-state solution is fine for the newspapers, but in the end, the long goal is to get rid of that Jewish state. I don't think it's necessarily to eradicate the Jewish people, as long as they are politically subservient. But that's disputable. I'm just going on the basis of what I see the history of the Islamic tendency to be. Toward the end of his life, and I'll see if there's any questions, Muhammad made one last, south of Medina, pilgrimage to Mecca. And this will be the fifth and final pillar of Islam. To, once in a lifetime, make the pilgrimage to the sacred city. There is a lesser pilgrimage and a greater pilgrimage that eventually gets codified in the Quran. The lesser one is sort of the 101 class, and then the greater one is a little bit more extensive. I'll talk about that in a moment. But at any rate, after Muhammad arrives, year 632, he suddenly falls ill. He hangs on for a few days, and he dies, without having publicly named a successor. And that will begin, that's where we begin today, with what will be the first major split in the Islamic community.
A lot like Alexander, who done the same thing.
Or a great many church pastors, you know, who run a big church, and then, I guess somebody's going to have to take over, and then nobody knows. So let me see if there's any questions, because today we're going to begin here, the first Caliths, which are successors to the prophet. Let me see if there's any questions about Muhammad, because now he's dead, at least in our class, and we're going to move on to other things.
A question.
Mm-hmm.
Did Muhammad himself begin to collect his own writings?
No.
I didn't think so.
That's what one of the things we'll have to talk about today. One of the tasks of his successors to collect, to arrange, and this is a controversial statement, to edit his writings. I believe there's a significant amount of editing. And archaeologically speaking, there's a growing body of evidence of editing.
Yeah.
I don't know, back when in the 80s and 90s, I used to watch Forensic Files. Anybody watch Forensic Files? They had these really creepy episodes where they used this thing called luminol, where you could find where if people wash the blood away, you put the luminol on it, turn off the lights, and it glows green. They made some really creepy horror stories about this. But they're able to do similar things with parchment and manuscripts to find out if they've been overwritten or if texts have been changed. So they're using chemical compounds to do this, and that has played a role too. Examination of early Islamic documents. So that is interesting. And in the case of Islam, you can do that more, say, than in the case of the Old Testament or the New Testament, which are hundreds of years older, thousands of years older, and have much longer history.
How do the powers that be in Islam look toward the idea of examining these texts? I mean, they've been very, very reluctant to allow archaeology to infiltrate Jerusalem or other places because they don't seem to want to know. They don't want anybody to have a second story or something.
Conservative Islam is like other conservative religious groups. They are for the life of the mind in word, but my impression is that they do a lot of information control. And they don't invite a whole lot of Q&A. There's a certain way you're supposed to believe, and that's what you do. And that's a problem because as they participate in Western civilization, They want to create universities. They want to create centers of learning. But oftentimes, the more advanced students begin to ask uncomfortable questions. And that can happen in any religious institution.
That same thing happens at Brigham Young University.
Yeah. My old Aramaic professor, I think I mentioned last week or the week before, is an ex-Mormon at BYU who dug a little too deep. And that can happen in Christian institutions. They've got maybe a statement of faith that says you're supposed to believe this, and then somebody finds something or thinks they have that doesn't quite jive with that, and what do? So, as we'll see, there is a liberal wing of Islam that develops, particularly in the eastern part of the empire, and we'll have to talk about that. In America, we tend to see the whole religion almost solely through the lens of its most extreme conservative advocates, because they're the ones that perform acts of violence sometimes. But the religion as it exists across the globe today is incredibly diverse. It has what we would call denominations. And some of them are so liberal that the conservative Muslims don't really think of them as real Muslims. Which is the same thing happens in Christianity. I see certain Christians and I think,
That'd be true in Indonesia especially, where there are a lot of
yes.
Muslims, but
Islam commingles with
really considerable.
Buddhism and mysticism and takes on its own coloring. And many of those kinds of Muslims would feel very at home in American politics, So that's interesting. And there have been a number of very good Muslim intellectuals and scholars throughout the last 1,000 years or so that I'll try to draw attention to. So today, at any rate, on the new lesson, and this would be page 16, I've pretty much covered all that I want to say about that. The 5 pillars of Islam. So first, you have to believe in Allah. You've got to believe that Muhammad is his prophet. In terms of practice, you have Shahadah, which is the confession. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. You have Salat. You have Zakat, Siyam, and Hajj. So that is to say, daily prayer, paying of taxes, the once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage to Mecca, and something else I'm missing here. Yeah, it'll come back to me.
What's in that big black box in Mecca?
That?
Kaaba.
Oh, so just a quick note, in Mecca, the Kaaba is just a large stone, probably fallen out of the sky some remote time in past, that became a focus of pagan polytheistic superstition. But Muhammad repurposed it for Islam, and that became the center of the Islamic faith. I actually say here, Mecca, on the second paragraph, from this time forward, Mecca will be regarded as the most ancient habitation on the earth. That's a problem from an archaeological perspective. Mecca is not the most ancient habitation on the earth. It's the place where the first man and woman were sent after their fall from the heavenly garden. It's the place where the biblical patriarchs built the first house of worship. That would be Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's also, again, no evidence for that at all. So some of these beliefs come in for some sharp historical and anthropological criticism. But at this point in the early Middle Ages, there, of course, is no way to disprove these kinds of claims. And where true religion is restored. So that's the Kaaba. So where it says the Rashidun Caliths, that's where I'm picking up today. So Muhammad dies. He makes no successor. And somebody asked about this last week. He sort of reminds me of Henry VIII. In spite of his many wives, he just can't seem to get a son. Maybe you know the type. There's always that man who's got like 7 daughters, and they're always thinking, we'll try again, and he gets an 8th daughter or something. Ali is his closest male relative, married to his daughter Fatima. And they produce the only male offspring of the prophet. He's got 2 grandsons, Hassan and Hussein. And those names continue to be very popular up to the present day. There's a huge power struggle. A group of family members bury Muhammad, and while they're doing that, the leaders of the community elect a successor, his longtime friend Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr will become the first caliph, and he's actually along in years now, so he will only be caliph for 2 years. However, that raises a problem because he is elected, and the family, after he's elected, say, no, that's wrong. Muhammad privately and secretly and in a way that only we know about said that Ali was to be his successor. And that becomes the beginning of the Shiite and the Sunni distinction. The Sunni think that the legitimate successor to Muhammad is elected by the leadership of the community. So there's an electoral process. And another thing about the Sunni is that they think of Muhammad's successor as a representative. So they're traditional. The caliph isn't supposed to innovate. He's supposed to do what Muhammad did. But the Shiite think that Muhammad's successor is a close family member and actually has a share of Muhammad's prophetic spirit and is therefore a more creative, perhaps, leader of the community, can introduce new things. And so the Shiite, they're the minority group, but they tend to be a little bit more radical. Today, their leaders are not called caliphs, they're called imams. And imams are regarded as prophets in their own right. So if you think of Islam as it exists in Iran, it's more radical than Islam as it exists in Saudi Arabia. The imams in Iran are direct prophets of God. If they say do something, you do it. The caliphs in Saudi Arabia are pencil pushers and book readers, and they remain within the close structure of what can be established on the basis of what Muhammad did. Which is interesting because you find similar divisions even in Christianity. Charismatic, Pentecostal, Methodist forms of Christianity will often treat pastors and religious leaders and the Holy Spirit as something that might presumably say something you hadn't expected. Whereas within ultra-conservative Christian circles, God is a retired author. He wrote the Bible, and now it's in the books. We as Paul said, don't go beyond what is written, and you stick with that. So there's a tension between these two groups, between viewing the successor to the prophet as somebody who just tries to follow in the train tracks that he laid out, and the one that speaks as though with a voice of authority. Thus says Allah. So, let me see if there's any quick questions on the Sunni and the Shiite, because the first 3 caliphs mean that the Sunni branch is the first, the majority, and the most powerful branch of Islam. The Shiite, the more radical branch, is the minority, and it will come up later. But like all minority groups, whatever it loses in terms of the majority, it gains in conviction in terms of the rightness of its cause. Because when you're the minority, that's a sign that You are right.
Just kind of an anecdote. Years ago when I was at the University of Detroit, I had a course in Hinduism with a Hindu professor, but about half the class were Muslim. And of the half the class were Muslim, about half of them were Sunni and the others were Shia. And they would get into ferocious discussions in the back of the class, because they always sat in the back. And T.K. Venkatesaran, who was my professor, he was doing his typical Hindu stuff, kind of lost in a cloud. They were back there arguing theology in the back of the room and getting loud. And the professor never noticed. I thought they were going to break out into a fist fight once. I mean, they were so aggressive that they were really angry, and Dr. T.K. just was floating along, it was crazy.
He was one with the universe.
Yeah, right.
I am one with the Force. The Force is one with me. Oh, that's from
Anyway, they're still
Rogue One.
fussing at each other, the Shiites and the Sunnis.
That's important because one of the tasks of Islam is not only the conquest of the world, but the unification of the Ummah community, which means that Muslims not only fight against pagans, Jews, and Christians, but they will fight against one another. And so you'll always hear stories about battles between Sunni and Shiites, and those are just as violent, oftentimes, as battles that they might have with local synagogues or churches. Any other questions or comments? So, Muhammad isn't long in his grave before the nation is split down the middle about his successor. All right. So I want to say, top of page 17, I want to say a few things about Abu Bakr. There's going to be 4. Now, I haven't put the 4th up here because that's Ali, and that marks the shift toward the Shiite group. But widely within Muslim circles, the Rashidun, that Arabic word that means rightly guided caliphs, are regarded as legit. Just as, say, within the history of the church, the first 7 ecumenical councils, not 100%, but are widely regarded by Christians as solid. So, a tradition is forming. Top page 17. Abu Bakr reigned for 2 years. In his inaugural address, he says, "Obey me, so long as I obey Allah and His Messenger." That's a caliph thing to say, because he's saying, I am in alignment with what has gone before. But if I disobey Allah and His Messenger, you owe me no obedience. So that's an important statement. That you could think of that as the way the Sunni think about their religious faith. His administration was the most successful in the history of the nation. In his own hometown, he secures the observance of Sharia law, especially the paying of taxes. He defeats tribes that attempt to rebel by waging jihad. And he secures the whole land of Arabia. So all right up here, Arabia conquered. So he finishes what Muhammad began. Now, once Arabia is conquered, if you know your geography, there's only one place to go, and that's north. And the jihad, unlike the war of ancient Israel against Canaan in the Old Testament, is limitless. You recall that Yahweh promised to Abraham the Holy Land. Once that Holy Land was conquered, the war against Canaan ended. Actually, the king wasn't even supposed to have chariots. It says that in the book of Deuteronomy. Why? Well, he's not to engage in wars of conquest. He's simply to take over and hold the land given to Abraham. So jihad is a little bit like the war of Israel against Canaan in the Old Testament, but it's boundless. It extends to the whole planet, and it won't end until the whole planet is conquered. Once he has Arabia, he sends his general Khalid ibn al-Walid to do war with the Persians and the Byzantines. So the Persians, over here in Parthia, are some of the last pagans, that is to say non-Jews and Christians living in this world, and then up to the Byzantine. Those are the Greek-speaking Christians up further north. Was there a question here? A simple message was sent to both civilizations: submit to Islam and be safe, or agree to the payment of the tax and you and your people will be under our protection. Otherwise, you will have only yourself to blame for the consequences, for I bring men who desire death as ardently as you desire life. So, that ought to give you a little, that was not intended to be, supposed to be scary. And that's true because one of the doctrines is that a young man who loses his life in waging jihad wins heaven. And so one of the things we'll have to talk about is what conservative Islam, on the one hand, the mentality it gives to young women, and also the one that it gives to young men. In some societies, the religion is incredibly oppressive to young women. And it's also, though, they'll send boys into battle who are, barely old enough to tie their shoes to fight. And boys like to fight. And actually, it's an honor for them to fight. And so this begins very, very early on. And that's going to make it difficult for the Byzantines and the Latins quite to know what to do. Just as, say, in World War II, the American soldiers were with these kamikaze fighters. When you're fighting against an enemy who is ready to sacrifice their own life for victory, it's a different kind of a war. It's just a very different kind of an enemy to know how to deal with. The Persians were the first to decline, so they said, thanks, but no thanks. And in a very quick campaign, the armies of the Caliph conquered the richest province of the empire, modern-day Iraq, 633. That would be Mesopotamia. Today we call it Iraq, is conquered. Byzantines also said no. They suffered heavy losses and retreated to Damascus, because the Byzantines are here in the Middle East. But the Muslims become entrenched in Palestine. So in the reign of Abu Bakr, he conquers Arabia, a significant part of Persia, and the Holy Land. So they're coming out. And then we move on to Umar. So we've got 2 more to go. Let me see if there's any questions. Just 2 years there. 2 years ago, they're moving quick. And you can imagine that the other civilizations in the Middle East and throughout the ancient world, they don't know where these people came from. They don't know where this religion came from. And these guys are fighters. So they're worried. Absolutely. The Byzantines actually later, this is later in the Middle Ages, Muhammad brought some of his laws in, particularly from the Old Testament. I mentioned he knew the Old Testament much better than the New, and one of them is not making idols. And so one of the reasons why the Byzantines thought it began to get around that they were losing battles against the Muslims is because they had statues and idols and the Muslims didn't. And so a very big debate arose, even a church council, as to whether in the Eastern Orthodox tradition they should make statuary anymore or whether they should just have icons. And many of you may know that even to the present day in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, they don't generally have statues. They have sort of 2-dimensional pictures with gold leaf in the background and some guy doing something like this with a little halo over his head. So that becomes like a big issue. The idea that maybe Yahweh was favoring the Muslim army because they were inadvertently engaged in idol worship. The people who began destroying statues were called iconoclasts because the icons, they would destroy them. And so they were called, we still use that word, iconoclasm, the destruction of icons or statues. And so some of the vocabulary and practice that is still part of the Eastern Church comes out of this conflict with Islam. All right, so Abu Bakr, 2 years, he's gone. Now, this came up earlier. He knew he needed to provide, page 17, a written collection of the prophet's oracles. And there's disagreement about whether he was the first to begin. That goes back and forth. But he appoints a successor named Umar. And Umar is the one, 634 to 644, during whose reign the Quran comes into being. So this is an important event. Muhammad...
Did Abu Bakr just die?
Yeah. He was old. He was like Ali. He had known Muhammad since the beginning. So he just died. I don't have the details of his death here. I think it was just old age. Umar is highly regarded by Sunnis, but not by the Shiites. He was a very influential ruler. He reformed the government of the nation. He kept his capital in Medina. So even though they're expanding, they still got to decide where's the capital city going to be. He kept it in Medina. He proposes a new calendar. New calendars are big for successful movements because you now begin rearranging all the months and the days of the year with respect to your movement. A lot of people don't know this, but during the French Revolution, they proposed a new calendar. And, you know, it seems odd that in the 19th century, you're going to just start a new calendar. But it didn't catch. Created new departments of government, so bureaucracy, filled the posts with close associates of the prophets, gave them good salaries. Now we have a system for interpreting the law, Sharia. We have a police force. We have public records. So, in short, the nation is crystallizing under this particular ruler and becoming what all nations have. In foreign affairs, well, before I get to that, though, let me look at this footnote 20, where it says the preservation of the Quran. Muhammad's followers either memorized whole chapters or wrote them down on palm leaves, wood, stone, bones, and leather. So this is before the Quran comes into being as a book. You might say, well, what are we dealing with? Verbal memory in writings on leaves, wood, stone, bones, and leather. Somebody's going to have to pull this together. You can't just have all these things floating around out there. So, a number of individuals are specifically mentioned in the tradition as recorders of oracles. Most important is Zayd ibn Thabit, and he is in communication with Umar of bringing all this together, organizing it into a book. So we'll talk a little bit further about that because that takes quite a long time. But you don't want to get the idea that when Muhammad died, he left the Quran. That's not how it happened at all. His successors had to pull a lot of material together. And that's tricky because in critical study of the Quran, they regard it as the verbatim, free of error or any kind of intrusive element whatsoever. But historically speaking, the process of compiling this is a very human process. The Bible is actually like that too. It's a very, very humanly put together book. I would say that the Bible doesn't claim for itself as much as the Quran does. And to that extent, it's not as much of an issue. Though some Bible thumpers, I think, claim more for the Bible than the Bible claims for itself. Yeah.
Would you say that perhaps the difference is that the Bible, yes, with Jesus, it was recorded after the fact similarly. However, unlike the Quran, there was already this whole history, this whole precedence of written materials prior that sort of backed up what was happening. And Muhammad doesn't have that. He doesn't have
Yes.
all of this ancient history and scripture on tablets talking about him or talking about a faith. It sort of started with him and then was written about him after him.
That's certainly a big part of it. So the composition of the Bible takes well over 1,000 years, going all the way back to the earliest documents, as opposed to almost a single generation. A second thing is that it is the Word of God, but it's written in the words of people. King David expresses doubts in the Psalms. Jeremiah prays that his enemies would not be forgiven. Well, it's not God speaking, that's Jeremiah, crankily frustrated. So there's a very human element in the biblical. God's word is there, but it's spoken in and through the struggles of human people. It's not regarded as God's verbatim words. So, in terms of the longevity of the Bible, in terms of the way we think about how it was written and composed, a very, very big difference. There's probably other differences too. Those are the two that jump out at me certainly most.
I assume that they believe that Allah speaks Arabic.
I have met Muslims that believe that God speaks Arabic, and as far back as the Middle Ages, that is the classical view, that Arabic is a divine language. There's also some problems with that, But I've met Jews that think that God spoke Hebrew because in the beginning He said Yehi or, let there be light, and He said it in Hebrew. I mean, those are ideas that are going to give you problems. Not if you don't, if you don't think too much or you don't have too much information, they won't give you problems. But if you start investigating, you're going to run into trouble. So, foreign wars, Umar organized the empire into provincial governments. So as Islam spreads, there's going to be provinces, just the way Rome used to have provinces. He allowed the army's officers to keep nearly half of the plunder. So he incentivized, that's the language we would use today, incentivized conquest. His generals kind of did most of the work, it looks like. The capital is 600 miles away from the nearest front, top of page 18. But the big immediate areas to conquer are Egypt, the Holy Land, Persia. That happens in a 10-year period. I mention here most notable events. After they take Jerusalem, they build a mosque where the Temple Mount used to be, and that mosque has remained. Now, there's going to be some things that happened during the Crusades. We'll get to that a little bit later. But that site of the Temple Mount, you might recall, is where Muhammad was said to have ascended into heaven. So that becomes a sacred site. Right now, to this day, that big gold dome that you see in the pictures, that's on the old Temple Mount. So that's when they first build the mosque there. Second, they take Caesarea, and I would love to forgive Umar for this as a Christian, but they burned down the library of Origen of Alexandria, and I just think he's going to hell for that. I value books, and you got to remember, at this point in history, There are no copy machines. There's no internet. It's incredible the amount of knowledge that was just burned when they took out that library. So every time I go through that in history books, I'm just like, ooh. And among the books were Papias's, I think, 6 volumes of oral traditions handed down by Jesus' immediate disciples. Those would be nice to have. I mean, Origen and others quote them at times. And Papias knew Philip and his daughters from the New Testament. He visited John, the disciple, and he composed scrolls that contain accounts of their verbal teaching that are not found in the Bible. Wouldn't those be nice to read? No, they're all gone. They're just all gone.
Which was worse in your estimation, the burning of the Library of Alexandria or Caesarea?
Alexandria was worse. So I don't forgive them for that either. But yeah, the burning of libraries is just incredible destruction. 3, this is the other one you just mentioned, the burning of the library at Alexandria. According to one famous tradition, the Caliph said, if these books are in agreement with the Quran, we have no need of them. And if they are opposed to the Quran, we should destroy them. So burn them or burn them. All right. In 10 years, they had taken over the Middle East. They had conquered the empire of Persia and 3/4 of the Byzantine Empire in just 10 years. Just 10 years. Now the Muslim empire is the largest empire in the whole world. So just to give an idea of how this is a lightning swift campaign. Now sometimes people ask, how did they accomplish so much in such a short space of time? I don't know that I can answer that, except to say that nobody saw this coming. Nobody was prepared for it. They did not engage in forced conversion, but they did tolerate people groups, and they segregated them into different communities. Great effort was made to ensure that the peninsula is exclusively inhabited by Arab Muslims. Yes?
A question. Do we have any idea of the population densities of Arabia, for instance, as compared with Europe or something like that? In terms of the largest empire, certainly geographically it was. Would that also be true in terms of
population? That's a good question. I think that information is available. I don't have it here in the lesson. But jot down a note. That would be interesting to know, because geographical extent is not the same thing as density, as we'll all be reminded of in election time this year. It's just these little blueberries scattered throughout. A small number of tribal polytheists were forcibly converted, but there were still a large number of Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians who lived within Islam. Zoroastrianism is the pagan religion of the Persians. It's not quite like polytheism. They have basically 2 main deities, a good one and an evil one. And so it's sort of like a Star Wars kind of a religion. Anybody ever read or studied any Zoroastrian books? Anybody have heard of Zoroastrian? Okay, you've heard of it. Zoroaster is also called Zarathustra, which Friedrich Nietzsche uses in his famous book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Anybody ever read that? Okay. It's good reading. Very positive. Actually, the winning of many converts could only mean a decrease in tax revenues and increase of foreign control of local government. So that's an interesting feature. They're not as eager to win converts as you might think. The tax and the exclusion of foreigners from government posts is keeping people in a state of secondary citizenship is a plus, as Islam spreads. So conquerors, at least at this early stage, do not seek to convert or even intermingle the local population, but just to exercise military rule over them from distant camps, garrisons, and colonial cities. Now, that won't remain throughout the whole history of Islam, but at least at this early stage, that seems to be the best way to do it. Okay, if I'm conquered by the Muslims at this early stage, what does that mean? I have to pay taxes, and I can't serve in the government. So, all you social climbers are out. What else does it mean? I don't have to do military service, so that's a positive. And I can exercise a large amount of political and religious autonomy. I can still observe my faith, maybe not in public. I can do it. Many subjugated peoples enjoyed a better situation than the one they had left behind, so some people are okay with it. Their situation becomes comfortable. Large number of Zoroastrian, Jewish, and non-Chalcedonian Christians accept Muslim rule and sometimes find that their taxes are even less than they were when the Muslims first took over. A Christian writer in Syria declares, "The God of vengeance delivered us out of the hand of the Byzantines by means of the Arabs." So that's fact stranger than fiction. You wouldn't have expected that. But that doesn't reflect the attitude and the situation of all. But at least for some people, it worked out for them, politically and economically, in a way that they might not have expected. All right. I'm going to move on to Uthman here in a second, but I won't probably get through the whole business. And I do want to say, this thing here. Let me see if there's any questions or comments before I throw anything out at you new. Sometimes these lessons are sort of like information blitz. And there's dates and places and names and things that take a while to digest.
So the wooden mosque in Jerusalem got rebuilt
Yeah.
into the Dome of the Rock at some point.
Yes, so the early mosque here is wooden and no longer exists. It's on the same site. Now the Crusaders will eventually take that place back for a season in the High Middle Ages. But Saladin, most of us have at least heard of his name or seen the movie with Orlando Bloom in it. What's the name of that movie? Isn't there a movie about the Crusades with Orlando Bloom?
Yes.
What's it called?
Something of heaven, what's it called?
Kingdom of Heaven? I don't know if it's any good.
I didn't like it.
Okay. You had a question or comment.
Yeah, are we going to have a church-sponsored class field trip to a mosque in Durban?
We are.
I suggest maybe Randy could bring it up tonight in this 3-hour committee meeting.
We should. I don't know if we'd be welcome.
Honestly, I work for your board, I'm just mad at them, so I'm just trying to.
I used to take my old Hebrew students to synagogue at the end of class and see if they could follow the liturgy, which sometimes they do a pretty good job.
Actually, I was part of a group of, it's a longer story, but I was part of a Christian mission group with a bunch of teens or college students. They were invited into a mosque and we got to observe worship and hear them. It was very unusual that was happening.
Can men and women go?
There were women there too, they'd go in the separate, by the wall. And then this one college young lady, she brought up that she followed Jesus and asked all these questions. And I really was expecting my life to end at that kind of time. Somehow I got out of there.
Anybody here? So, what was that mosque you said? Yeah. A long time ago.
Remember what I had for breakfast?
We have two mosques.
Yeah. Well, Muslims in America tend, I think, to be Sunnis, which is milder than the Shiite branch. And American culture definitely has an impact on these people. Muslims are very concerned as people come into America because of that impact, but we see more and more of them. I find that a lot of the young people get mosques in Greek Orthodox churches confused because they look similar. And many of the traditions of Islam are really Orthodox traditions from the early Middle Ages, like the veil over women in the architecture and other features, were Christian traditions before they passed into Islam, but now in many Christian circles, Christians have outgrown them, but they've been crystallized within Islam. So, yeah, I don't know if we would probably if we were able to visit a mosque, it'd probably have to be a liberal one, but I don't know that conservative ones would let us wiggle in there. But I like the idea. You might have been tongue-in-cheek with that. I actually like that idea.
Yeah, it was tongue-in-cheek. Are you throwing a challenge out to me?
Why don't you check it out?
I could have some time on my hands.
Yeah, I'd be willing to do it. Like I said, I used to take the Hebrew students to synagogue. I would love to take some of our Latin students to a Tridentine Mass in Latin and see how well they could do. We practice a lot of our Latin. Our grammar is written by a guy who's clearly Roman Catholic, But with what's going on at the school, I better hold off. There's always a concern that they're trying to Catholicize the kids.
So if you want me to, all jokes aside.
Yeah. Check it out. We'll check it out. If you take a look, I'm going to end here today. If you take a look on page 19, just kind of for your homework, this links up with something I said. I'll just put this bug in your ear and we'll close out. It says, footnote 24, the Sana'a manuscript. That was discovered in Yemen, in which I believe there's some political activity going on right now, in 1972. This is one of the oldest manuscripts of the Quran. It's dated to before 671. If you look at these dates, it's very, very early in the history of transmission. So this is very close to the time when they first began compiling and writing down the Quran for the first time. It's made out of parchment, that means animal skin. It contains 2 layers of text, a lower one that has been washed off and an upper one written over it. So there's that luminol thing I was talking about earlier. Metal was used in the original ink, and that has enabled the recovery of the original text through chemistry. Upper text conforms almost perfectly to the standard version of the Quran. Lower text contains a significant number of variations. So if you're interested following up on that, the point is that the claim to the divine verbatim words of Allah handed down with no human intermediary, I don't think, even if I wasn't a Christian, I don't think that claim is sustainable. It's not a sustainable claim. And these sorts of archaeological investigations can be very controversial within the Islamic community. And for young intellectual Muslims growing up and trying to use their reason and engage, these can be powerful, what do they call it these days? Fact checkers. It's a fact check. So we mentioned that earlier. I wanted to draw attention to that particular manuscript because that's fairly recent, 1970s, I consider. It's within my lifetime, almost. So I was born in 77. The Carter administration. All right, thank you. We're all done here. I'll go grab a bite to eat.